Welcome to Sidelined. I'm your host, Brian Lehman. We love sports, but what happens when we realize that there's a lot of ethical questions surrounding them? Enter Sidelined, a 4-episode series looking at various ethical issues around sports. The book Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back has been key in making this podcast, and today I'm joined by the co-authors, Jessica Luther and Kavitha Davidson. So how did you all come to work together?
Not really. I mean, Twitter is the answer to that question. Yeah. I mean, Twitter's a cesspool, obviously, but it is also really good for finding communities. And the women's sports writer community is small and extremely tight knit. And Jessica and I do similar work, and, we'd read each other's work and followed each other on Twitter. And yeah, so, I mean, we had a book deal before we ever met in person. And last week was actually the 5-year anniversary of the first time we ever met in person at South by Southwest.
There you go.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much that simple. It's a simple story.
Wow. Book deal before you met in person. I guess that's what we live in now with all technology and everything.
It was an odd harbinger for
this world we're in now. Yeah.
A book tour in a pandemic, right?
That was kind of my follow-up question. What was it like producing a book during a pandemic?
Well, so we basically had the book written. This is a good story now that it's over. But it took us years to write the book, and then it goes through, pretty heavy edits, and it had been copy edited. And then sort of the final thing that happens is it gets written, it gets what they call, I think, paginate it. They put it on the page the exact way they're going to print it. And then we get to look at that. If we have like really minor things, we can change them, but that's kind of it. And we were, I don't know, I think we're within a week of going to print. So the book was like, we had seen the layout, we had done all of that. And Rudy Gobert got COVID and the NBA shut down. And it was like the whole world was just up. Like, we didn't know what was going to happen at that point. So we had a panicked meeting with our editor the day after Rudy got sick. And it was scary. Like, we didn't really know what to do about it. We ended up adding, there's a couple paragraphs, I think, in the intro. I can't remember my own book. I think in the intro about COVID, and sort of, we didn't know what sports will look like on the other side of this, and discussions about, is it okay to publish a book in the middle of a deadly pandemic? Where will we be on September 1st? Will there be sports? And it did turn out that literally every single sport was happening. It felt like on September 1st when the book came out, but it was, we really had no concept of what we were going to look like on the other side. So, that part of it was hard. And then stuff just changed. So from the point that it went to print, I guess in March, we're at the anniversary, until it published in September, there were massive changes. Like the chapter on racist mascots was the most obvious. We were clearly behind at that point with the Washington NFL team's name change. All the stuff around athlete activism took on a whole nother level during COVID itself and its impact on sports. All that stuff was old. It still hit at the right time, I would say. It's been strange. We did our book tour via Zoom, and there's some nice stuff about not traveling all the time, but also a bummer to not be able to see each other and not be able to talk to people in person. And, we passed book plates back, and we mailed book plates back and forth so we could have signed copies. And
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was also just a question. We weren't sure if it would be responsible to publish a book about sports in the middle of a pandemic when people are dying, and do people care about sports? And it turns out they really do.
Yeah,
and
like too much.
And yeah, I mean, and the funny thing about the launch or the publication date also was that I think we chose September 1st because we were like, start of the NFL season, right? And then the moment of panic that we had was, will there be an NFL season? Will it start on time? And then, of course, the NFL just didn't acknowledge that we were living through a global pandemic for the entire summer. So, of course, the NFL season started on time, which was obviously great for our book. But yeah, it was a process, definitely. And it was the second time that we had to, in a panic, add something to the book. The first time was in January after Kobe Bryant died.
Yeah, Kavitha added a pretty big section at the end of the book about that, because he's sort of embodied.
Yeah, I read
all
that.
of these dilemmas. Yeah.
He's like, the idea of him embodied so much of what we were talking about in the book. But yeah, even that was far enough into the process that Kavitha had to like make a real argument for
Convince my
adding
editor.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Which was the right call at the end of the day. But like that was January.
Absolutely.
You know, imagine March.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you got to make concessions when a pandemic happens.
Yeah. But we had never, we hadn't experienced a pandemic or, I've published a book before, but not co-authored like this and all those things.
Someone should write a piece about all of us who have published books in the pandemic, like just what that process has been like. I would read that.
I've got episode 1 right here. I could see how like the pandemic definitely made writing your book harder because you had all this stuff to update last minute. But then again, it also kind of looks like it helped you out because 2020 was kind of like the catalyst that kind of brought a lot of this stuff to the forefront, maybe a little bit more than it was before, maybe just continue the process of what was already happening.
I think COVID laid a lot of stuff bare in a way that didn't necessarily work the year before. But obviously we had written the book already. So, we had written literally 99.9% of the book that you see there before any of this happened, before this was even like an idea that this could happen. But I do think, it's sad. Like it feels weird in any way to talk about anything good from the pandemic just because of the loss of life, suffering and all that stuff. But it made a lot of our points for us. The discussions that were happening, it just sort of reified all the stuff that we were already thinking about and writing about.
Because there wasn't any sports, you couldn't stick to sports, right?
Right.
Excuse me. Because
Right.
there wasn't any sports, you couldn't stick to sports. So, the whole stick to sports argument just kind of flew out the window. And that was part of what, NBA players were debating actually when it came to restarting the season and entering the NBA bubble was, we've made so much progress in the last couple of months since the killing of George Floyd about using our platforms to talk about these other issues and social justice and all of that. If we go back to playing games, will it distract people from all of this work that we've done? That's a real conversation that happened. So in a similar way, when we didn't have sports to talk about or to watch, all of the stuff that Jessica and I wrote about and talk about in the book were the only things to talk about when it came to sports.
Yeah, but even now with the March Madness and the NCAA, what is the hashtag? Whatever the thing about how they're people playing this game, like we're still seeing it's really something to watch it in real time over the last year. It's just a whole nother level.
Right. Yeah, I certainly helped you out in a probably wasn't the best phrasing. You know how I meant it, I think, and that it got more people to think about that maybe hadn't thought about it before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true.
Yeah. So what led you to write this book? Why sports ethics? I mean, your careers have kind of gone down that route of advocating for ethical things, but what brought you to this point? Put pen to paper.
So there's a broader answer to that question, and there's a narrow answer to that question. The narrow answer, like tying it to a specific event, is that, and we think we're like 80% sure of this origin story, and so we're going with it, but it's also just been a really long time. It was around the time of the Super Bowl, and you always get those pieces that are really condescending and geared toward women and geared toward women who are assumed not to be sports fans, so not Jessica or me. And it's always something to the effect of, how to survive a Super Bowl party, how to talk to your boyfriend about football, And it was just so tiring. We'd gone through in our careers and just in life, in just being women sports fans, we've gone through years and years of sports media just not catering to us, of not imagining us as fans and not imagining us as readers or viewers. So we were talking about doing, like a snarky rejoin to that. We were like, we should just write a whole book about, how to talk to your boyfriend who knows less than you about sports, because that's Jessica's husband, and that's most of the men that I date. Jessica had already had a conversation about doing something with the publisher at the University of Texas Press, along the lines of the intersection of sports and culture and politics and that kind of thing. So we took the snarky idea, and our publisher and our editor, Casey, at UT, massaged it into this much more serious thing that we put out, and thankfully so.
So you weren't, this was not the original. You were intending, it wasn't going to be this hard, right?
I think it would have been harder to write.
I do too.
That's a column, right? That's not a whole.
And we kind of just sat down and wrote a long list of the things that we cared about in sport that we thought other fans might have issues with, right? These are the struggles that they have as a sports fan, and that got whittled down, and then we divided it up, and each one of us took that list and we sort of did the first draft, and we then began the process of back and forth between us and with the editor.
And these are all things that just as fans and as sports writers that Jessica and I talk about all the time, right? Like these are all issues that a bunch of us already acknowledge and discuss. And there have been whole books written on each of these issues, but we just hadn't seen a book that had all of them in one place and that framed them as fan dilemmas, which is really the essence of the book.
Yeah, I think I like that framing. Like that was honestly what attracted me to the book when I saw it on either the ESPN or NPR recommended books list. I don't know. It was encouraging.
We're on the NPR recommended books list.
It was either NPR or ESPN. It was like right around the new year where they do like their.
Maybe it was the Undefeated.
I think it was the Undefeated. Yeah. Okay.
When we were next to Barack Obama's book.
I know it was a little bit ridiculous.
It may have been. I looked at a few books lists. It may have been the Undefeated. One more question. A quick one about the book, and then we can kind of get into talking about some of the issues here. What was your favorite chapter and what was the most challenging?
This is always a hard question. I have an easy answer for the most challenging, and this has been fun to do this with Kavitha. I'm like, she knows exactly what I'm going to say. Absolutely writing the doping chapter for me. I was the first drafter on that one, and I was so arrogant going into that. I knew exactly what I was going to say, what I was going to learn, what I was going to say. I was so like, this is black and white, you cheat or you don't cheat, da, da, da. And I started doing research and I was like, there's no way to put your thumb on any of this. And I definitely didn't understand the Balco scandal at all. Like my memory of it, that it was 100% baseball players. As soon as you start reading it, there's really great journalism on it. So that had nothing to do with like what was actually reported at the time. It was more like the larger narrative within our culture and how we talked about and who we cared about. Like who do we actually care when they dope? So that was really challenging for me. The chapters were supposed to be something like 4,000 to 5,000 words. And I think I turned in like a 7,500 to 8,000. I think I doubled the size because I was just like overwhelmed by the information. And I just gave it to Casey and I was like, go ahead, sir. Just cut this down. So that was definitely for me the most challenging. And I would say the most, I guess, fun for me was probably writing the tennis chapter because I just absolutely love tennis, and that it was fun to watch Serena serve like over and over and over and over again to like capture the description of like what it looks like to how she serves and to think about it a lot. And so I think just because that's my favorite sport to think about in general, I enjoyed that one.
Yeah, that Serena serve is my favorite lead in the book for sure. I think the most challenging chapter for me to write was probably the gendered violence chapter, just because it's, just something that Jessica and I cared so much about. I'm a sexual assault survivor, and I, had to try really hard to keep my own feelings about this out of the chapter. But it was also cathartic to be able to interview people and have them kind of voice my feelings for me, and that other people have this dilemma in a really strong way. My favorite chapter, probably the WNBA chapter, I think is my favorite chapter, just because, again, these are just things that Jessica and I talk about all the time. And I feel like that chapter is every talking point that we've, said over and over and over again, but in a really nice, cohesive book chapter. So it was nice to just be able to put that down on paper. And also was at a time, that was another one that was incredibly well timed. It was at a time when the WNBA completely overhauled its CBA and is going through this incredible transition and growth period. So yeah, I would say that chapter is probably my favorite.
I just want to add, because you said your favorite lead was the tennis one, that my favorite lead, Kavitha lead for sure, was the stadium subsidies, where you write about like going into the stadium. It's so evocative. I love the beginning of that chapter.
It made me want to walk into a stadium.
Yeah, right?
Honestly, man, talk about COVID. I just want to walk into a Yankee Stadium right now.
I did think of you when I saw that news, Kavitha.
I am half vaccinated though, so.
There you go.
There you go.
That's good.
Yeah, I got a leftover one. I was a leftover person.
I mean, that's how a lot of people I know have gotten it, because they can't refreeze them, right?
Right.
And, the Walgreens in New York are only serving seniors. So seniors are more likely to miss their appointment. And then at the end of the day, I just know a bunch of people who just camped out at like Duane Reade or Walgreens and just been like, yep, I mean, we have to throw these out. You want a vaccine? And it's great. I mean, listen, the more people who get it, the better, obviously. So
Yeah. I volunteered at one of the mass vaccination sites, and they have people that don't show up. And so we got left over. But I loved it so much. I went back next weekend. I'm trying to go back next weekend too, or this upcoming weekend. Talk to strangers. I was like, when was the last time I talked to strangers?
not for a piece.
Yeah, exactly. Certainly not in person.
Right.
Like I was just like chatting with people.
Mm-hmm.
I can still do it.
So let's kind of transition into the book. In the introduction, Dr. Susan Whitbourne, there's a piece in there where she talks about how sports is just really a part of family and culture and identity, and the cognitive dissonance that comes when you try to tell somebody that part of their identity isn't okay. Anything y'all want to comment on about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's the essence of these dilemmas. She put it perfectly, is that no matter what you're talking about, we've got 14 chapters in the book. No matter what you're talking about, the reason it's difficult for us to talk about them is because of how sports fandom is formed. She put it really well that, think about when you become a sports fan, think about how you become a sports fan. It usually happens much earlier in life than your other proclivities. It's usually childhood. It's usually has something to do with family or your hometown. It's your identity, essentially. It really is impossible to extricate yourself from your sports fandom. So that's why when all of these things in sports are being challenged, it feels like you're being challenged. That's why it's really hard to reconcile these dilemmas.
During the past year, I kind of had that conflict. It's actually kind of a segue. Before we do that, did you want to comment on that, Jessica?
No, I think Kavitha said it really well. I mean, I'm a generational fandom. Like I can't remember not watching football in my house, especially Florida State football. And it was just like part of what we did. And it was absolutely and part of the identity of the family. And it was painful. Did I write about this in the book? I don't know what's even in there. I don't really watch college football anymore. And it was like breaking up. Like it was a painful thing to give it up. And I do understand when fans feel implicated when you point all this stuff out. And it goes back exactly to what Dr. Whitbourne was describing in the book. I still think it's good for us. It's good to acknowledge that it's hard.
Yeah, we did have a fan, it's a friend of mine actually, who's a fan of the Washington football team, in the Loving Sports When You Hate Your Owner chapter. And he said that he doesn't watch football anymore. And it's hard for him, obviously, because he remembers loving it, but it's also hard for him on a practical level that, when he's home in Baltimore with his family every Sunday, they're watching football and he has to kind of go upstairs and he can't really partake in that social aspect of it.
It was really weird for me to give up the small talk of college football. Like I was telling Kavitha this at some point during the last season. You did a show on The Lead about some Alabama running back.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I don't even know the name of the, like, I had to like Google. I was just like, how? And I used to know everything. Like I could have a college football conversation with anyone at any time. I was so knowledgeable, and just even giving up the ability to do that kind of chatter with someone was strange, and still feels really strange to me when it hits me that there was a point where, was it this season or last season, Georgia was ranked number 1, and I remember texting a friend and being like, is that right? Like, are they good? Like I had no idea, which is like, for 30 years of my life, I would structure my entire fall around this one sport. So it's amazing how much it has an impact on your life, especially when you start to remove it. You really feel it.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about that small talk because, and this is kind of off topic, but, sports is the easiest way to engage strangers. Jessica, you're just talking about strangers. Like whenever, we're back in bars en masse, it's the most common way to do it. Now, obviously not everyone is a sports fan, but if you know nothing about somebody and you're trying to engage them in conversation, the easiest way to do that is to talk about sports.
Yeah, I think so. And it's almost like something you could add on to say the two things that people don't like to talk about is religion and politics, but the things that you can always talk to somebody about is sports or the weather, but sports is slightly more engaging.
We are way past the era of not talking about politics at bars, by the way.
Oh no, I'm not. That's the saying.
No, I know.
Yeah, I believe we should be able to, talk about politics and religion and learn to, talk through those things even if we don't agree. But anyway, so yeah, I guess let's just start with chapter 1. So like the CTE, and of course there's a lot of ethical issues. This is just one that stuck out for me because brain injuries are different. Like you don't recover from those, and that was the thing that kind of kept coming back in my head. And I kind of put it off for a couple seasons. I kind of like rationalized and talked with my family. And I was kind of like, yeah, it's fine. Like they know what they're doing. And then the more I thought about it, I'm like, you're signing up to smash your brain around for 10 years, maybe 2.5 to 10 on it. I think 2.5 is the average. And then what? You die early. You can't be there for your family. You can't make those decisions that you need to make. And just the unforgiving, no going back aspect of it kind of really drove it home until like this season, like halfway through the season, I was just like, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I just cut myself off from football. Like I miss it. I kind of think the book helped a little bit, but it didn't. Like y'all's approach is like, here's the issue. Now, what do we do about it? And I guess we'll kind of get to this towards the end, but there was kind of like the two options, but it was almost open-ended. Like we have to decide each individually what we're going to do about it, whether, boycott or advocate or what is it? And is it even okay? And I guess when I got the book, I was kind of hoping at the end of the chapter you could do, hey, it's okay, and here's why. And that wasn't quite how it turned out.
No.
Yeah.
The original title of the book was How to Love Sports and They Don't Love You Back. And we realized pretty quickly that the how of that was almost impossible to do, that so much of the book is talking about big systemic issues. And there's really, I think individuals have a role to play in changing systemic issues, obviously, but at the same time, you're just an individual. You're like, we all have to draw lines and decide what we feel comfortable with and what we can stomach and what we can handle and all sorts of things. And it's like how arrogant for us to tell every person exactly how to be the right kind of sports fan. I don't even know what that means. But yeah, so that's funny. Sorry that's not in the book. But yeah, I mean, there's a reason we chose to lead the book off with brain trauma. I think in some ways it's such an interesting topic because sorry, Kavitha, I'm going to steal your point, that you can't really change it, right? Like you can't change football to make it so that there is no brain
There's
trauma.
no such thing as safe football.
Yeah.
It just doesn't
so if we're going to
exist.
continue to, as a culture, enjoy this game, we just have to accept on some level that is the outcome. But it's also an interesting topic because the science we're still learning a lot. So this idea that they're professionals and they know what they're doing and they're making, informed consent, basically. And that's not even totally clear. And we have to problematize the fact that they're laborers and they're making choices, to feed their family and all sorts of things are actually going into play. And then on top of it, that there's actually brain trauma in a lot of sport. And there's brain
it's
trauma.
not just football.
Yeah. I mean, the figure skating one really was just like, as soon as you read it, you're like, of course, they're falling on the ice and hitting their head. That makes sense. But we don't really see it very often. So we don't think of it as like an actual outcome. But even like BMX bikers, it's actually everywhere. And it's something we're going to have to figure out in some way. And, and I really do think it's one thing to talk about professional athletes. That's true of all these issues. It's one thing on the professional level. But this was a good space to point out that youth sports is if we really want to problematize brain trauma and the choices that we're making as a society around this, it's real bleak when you start thinking about children. And so it just offered us a lot of different ways to think ethically about this issue that is so ingrained in so many sports. And yeah, we don't offer an easy out. I mean, the scientist at the end doesn't offer an easy out, right? She's still a huge advocate of sport. She just wants us to change how we manage concussions and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. It's have y'all seen Football High, the PBS Frontline documentary from 2011?
I think so.
I don't think I have.
Yeah. This issue had kind of been bubbling in the back of my head. But then I watched that for a class like last semester. and it just kind of blew it up. I'm like, I just couldn't ignore it anymore. And the thing that really compelled me, that made it, or one of the things, like obviously it's serious, but like subconcussive hits can lead to, like, okay, like we can make better helmets and we can have better protocols and we can keep people from getting concussions as much. We can lower that risk. But then the thought that somebody could get CTE never having a concussion their whole career and we never even knew, that's where it just felt irresponsible and like unkind just to put somebody out there in the field like that.
And it's hard because, one of the things we love about football is it's brutal. I mean, we have to just admit that, like, that's part of what is exciting, is the hit and the sound and all that sort of stuff. And it matters that the league itself doesn't really want to take care of these guys once they've put their brains and their bodies on the line in ways that are so damaging. So it's not like, even when you're rationalizing it to yourself, you can't be like, well, at least I know the NFL is going to take care of these guys as they get older. Or we don't live in a country that has socialized healthcare. So it's not even like our society is going to take care of these guys as they get older. And we know now, especially these stories of, and this is true for hockey as well and the NHL, and it can be a really rough go, and you have to, it's like, is it worth it for my entertainment? I do think fans should have to reckon with that.
Is it okay to be entertained by somebody else permanently damaging their brain? And that's, I don't know, that's a tough one.
That's a tough way to frame that. Because I would also say that if you did remove all of the other stuff, I do fundamentally believe in people having agency to choose whether they want to box for a living or play football for a living. No, but having all of the information and education about the implications there. The problem is you can't remove all of that other stuff because it's not, even with the education gap and the lack of information and the NFL's own hand in all of that and suppressing the science and the medicine, people are making these decisions because of socioeconomic reasons and because of their backgrounds and where they came from. And so I think fundamentally it's okay, like when you reduce it down, sure, like it's okay to be entertained by brutality, but you can't remove all of that other stuff that allows people to make undistilled decisions with their own bodies. So
yeah, but that's why it was important to have Joel Anderson in that chapter, right? Someone who had played a bunch of football and would not go back and change it. And like that matters too, that there is a bunch of positive stuff that can come out of it. And how are we as individuals, especially on the outside? Like, again, that's why we can't tell you what to do, because it's just too complicated and a thing to say there's a right answer here.
You're right, Kavitha. Framing's a big part of it. You can take just about anything and boil it down to one statement that, phrases it what makes you lean one way or the other. And maybe that's part of the issue with these ethical things, is trying to get people to think about it in different frames than maybe they did before. And let's kind of use that as a segue. Talk about, chapter 3, the racist team and mascot chapter. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say like the name of the Washington football team anymore, the former name. Like that's like,
I would not say it.
Yeah, we know what it is.
We don't say it.
I don't need to. We know what it is. That name, if it had not been normalized by being on a football team, I would have thought it was derogatory.
It was
instinctively. Well, it is
derogatory, right?
It is,
like that's the thing, is it was, and also the name of the capital football team in this country, right?
Right. I mean, it is derogatory, but if it had not been, like, I would have thought about it more if it wasn't normalized.
Right. Yes, absolutely. They gave people permission to say it.
Right. And, it was kind of like just listening to sports radio. One day people are just talking about a normal conversation, like, this is the team, this is its name. And then the next day they're like, can't do it. I'm like, yeah, that's a really bad name. Like, why was that a thing for so long?
Yes, that's a good question. And there were a lot of outlets that chose not to print it, right? There was something
the
like
Washington
80...
Post. Yeah. I mean, I think the most prominent one was the Washington Post's editorial board made the decision years ago not to use that word. The news board was still using it to report when they reported on the sports, but the editorial board decided not to. And I think a lot of us individually just made those decisions for ourselves as well.
Oh, no, this is kind of one of those things where some people get upset that it's a big deal is being made about it. And I try to understand both sides of it. Obviously, I'm not in favor of using a derogatory name and, treating people like that. But it kind of goes back to what Dr. Whitbourne said about it being part of your identity. Y'all brought that out in the chapter. How do you get people to think about it differently? Is there a way to understand both sides? And I think it just comes down to just trying to listen more and really kind of empathize with people.
Yeah, I mean, these activists had been talking about this for decades. Like, this isn't just something new that the Indigenous community has, glommed onto.
Yeah, they didn't get a bee in their bonnet last year or
Right.
something. Yeah.
Right. This isn't cancel culture. And yeah, the problem is that nobody was listening to them for 40 years, basically. So yeah, listening more is a really good idea, especially for white people. And I think that, whenever your identity is wrapped up in something racist, you should be implicated and you should have to confront that, even if it's hard.
Yeah. I mean, we change stuff all the time. I mean, teams change their names all the time, and most of the time it's fine. And so I do think asking people, like, why do you care this much about this thing that a group of people continues to tell you is harmful? Like, what is your actual investment in this? And I think, picking that apart and really showing that is important. On some level, it's not shocking that it took until 2020. I was shocked when they changed it, I will say. Like, that was a truly shocking announcement based on what Dan Schneider had said for so many years. And at the same time, they should have just changed it forever ago. It just doesn't, I mean, like, financially, it makes a lot of sense. They're going to, as soon as they announce the new name and they put out the new gear, they're going to make a ton of money off of it. It just doesn't make any, I don't know. It's like the Washington or the Wizards. Is that their name?
That's the basketball. That's the basketball
but they
team,
changed it, right? From the Bullets. And that, like, everyone lived. There's still a team. Like, it's not as if there is not even a precedent within the city itself to just do this. There was that great Red Hawks campaign a couple of years ago where they've made all the fake Washington Post and New York Times stories and sort of showed what it would look like if they had just changed the name to Red Hawks in the image. And it was so real looking. They did such a good job with it. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, they actually did it. And it was like, you could just do it. Like, it's actually not hard.
Well, and kind of to that point, like, this just shows you how out of touch Dan Snyder is in general. The fact that they are announcing a new name when everyone likes Washington football team, like, everyone likes that. It's fun. It's kind of retro. There's a whole space in sports Twitter that is mad that that's not going to be their permanent name.
Yeah, people are up for it. Like, you can do a whole fun campaign to name a new thing. Like, it's not, and we've seen it, like Adidas did their whole thing where they were giving high schools the chance to change their names from native names, and they would provide all the uniforms, and like, they could do it. I mean, if a poor high school can manage to change their stuff, certainly a professional sporting team can do it. And so I do think, even now, I think it's worth taking the time to really think about why it took this long to get to this point and what that really says about how we as a country even think about Native people in general. There's still dozens of high schools in this country that use that word as their mascot. And so we still have quite a ways to go here. As someone who went to Florida State, I have a real issue with the chop and all the things that go with it. I have issue with the Seminoles in general as a mascot. Yeah, I think we need to keep pushing on this. I think this tells us a lot more about our own relationship in this country to Native people and to Indigenous people than we really want to admit.
Well, especially because this doesn't necessarily signal a cultural shift, because Nike and Pepsi investors wrote letters saying that they would pull their sponsorship. On the one hand, I mean, it does represent a cultural shift in that the reason they had to do that was because people started to be more angry about this, which is good, but it doesn't represent some kind of seismic shift.
Thinking about it, it just adds a whole other layer of insult that this team is based in DC.
Yes, it does.
Where the government, the first thing that pops to my mind is the government and the Trail of Tears.
Yeah, and a lot of Native people, their relationship to the U.S. government is that they are also nations. And there are treaties that this nation has just constantly walked all over and ignored. It's like a particular painful thing that it was in Washington, D.C., down the road from the Capitol. It's mind-boggling when you really think about it, that this was a thing that went on for so long.
I've wondered, like, how do they even arrive at that name? Like, who thought that was a good idea? Like, especially for DC. I mean, at all, but especially for the Capitol.
Well, it was a racist white man, is who it was.
that would make sense. So Cleveland in Major League Baseball is doing something similar. And so I guess this is a transition that I think will be well received by many, not so well by others, but that's okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, Chief Wahoo needed to go decades ago as well, so at least they phased him out. They need to phase out the Indians' name. The Braves need to phase out the tomahawk chop. The Chiefs need to phase out that chant. There's still a lot of work to be done here.
I do want to ask you about the Chiefs and the Braves and in the NHL, the Blackhawks. Are those names that the book helped me to see like how just even that association could be insulting? Are those names considered insulting in and of themselves? Like obviously what Washington moved away from was derogatory, but are those other sports names considered derogatory as well in some way?
I think, yeah, using Native people as mascots is more the issue than necessarily the name. It's the fact that people show up in red face. It's the fact that, you put up effigies of Native people, you know, like things that really I cannot drive home enough that this country, like the federal government, state governments, like paid people to kill Native people. Like that was like a federal project. And so all of these things that allow us to recreate that power dynamic, like that is messed up. I mean, like we should really even be talking about the 49ers. Like that name is not great either. If you go back and look at the history of the 49ers, and they killed a bunch of Native people to make space for those people. And that was a state project in California. So there's a lot here, right? But at least with the 49ers, you don't get the immediate imagery and you don't have the same kind of mocking chants and those sorts of things. And so, yeah, I think that Native people, it's not like Kavitha and I have like shown up and are like, this is an idea we had. It's like Native and Indigenous people have been, I mean, the Cleveland Indians, they have been protesting them since the 60s. Every single opening day since the 60s, they have been out there saying, please change this name. And no one will listen to them. I mean, not no one, but not the people in charge. And so, Native people are asking for these changes. And that for me, that's enough. Like we should change it.
And I've heard a group quoted like that maybe one group of Native Americans were saying that, oh, we don't mind, but then how many more are there where it really is a problem? And I think in the book it brought something out about that with Florida State, where there was a kind of a group in Florida that wasn't really protesting it, but then if you talk about a group in another part of the country, then it was a big issue there. And so we can all find, like, if you want to find a reason to justify it, you can find a reason, but it doesn't mean it's actually justified.
Right. I think lots of people find ways to justify racism all the time. And I would like to imagine that we can agree that that doesn't make it okay to then be racist.
Yeah, no. So let's kind of talk about the two alternatives or the two solutions that were kind of a thread throughout the book. You can either kind of boycott or advocate is kind of where you're left. When you recognize that there's these issues, you either walk away or you try to make it better. We're kind of left with the question, is advocating good enough? Like are some of these problems just so unfixable that we need to boycott? And as we've kind of talked about already, that's kind of a call that people need to make as individuals. You have thoughts or comments on that and how that became a thread throughout the book?
Well, I mean, yeah, individuals can't change systems, and these are systemic issues that we've written about in the book. But individual action collectively can help change systems, and that's what we saw with the Washington football team. And that's what we're seeing with all of these D&I initiatives that every company is going through right now. So advocacy is important. It's also just important to have these conversations and to not, one of the things that we wanted the book to provide was space to have these conversations and not to stick to sports, because that's not how anything changes.
Yeah. I think certainly boycotting. I mean, I've chosen in some ways to boycott certain things. At the same time, like I continue to report on college football because I would like it to be better. Like I'm not letting go of it. I personally can't handle watching it. I'm not fun to watch college football with. Like I'm a sad little encyclopedia over here, but I still want it to be better. I think that's possible in some ways. I wouldn't spend so much time doing what I do. And at the same time, Kavitha's totally right? The entire point of the book is to provide people, like to start a conversation, but also like to give people facts in order to do the kind of advocacy to make sure that we're having the right kind of conversations about this. I think we've all been stuck in those conversations where you're like, we're not even talking about the same thing here. We don't have the same knowledge base about racist mascots. And so, I think as individuals, you are kind of left. I don't know though. I think you can both advocate and sometimes you have to step back and boycott. And I think sometimes those things are happening simultaneously.
Right. There's one more thing. Let me get your thoughts on this before we wrap it up here. It's kind of maybe an example of making it better. There was a chapter on the Olympics and how that's just really awful for whoever has the burden of putting it on. I feel like I read this idea somewhere. I can't remember where. Well, why don't the countries pool resources and put together like a reusable, like, I don't know, like on an island or like a Mount Olympus or an Olympic island or something that they could go back to year after year after year without having to have host cities that cause all the problems that they do.
I mean, my gut answer is because the IOC can't make as much money doing it that way. That's my gut. But wouldn't that be amazing? We have Olympic Island.
Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. Like, and it could even be a man-made island. Just throw it out there somewhere, or
sure.
or one of the Hawaiian Islands, or I don't know. Oh well, then you got the same issues if it's the Hawaiian Islands.
Yeah, you do.
All right. Well, it's getting to be about that time. I'll let y'all go. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk with me about this. I just thought it was cool just to be able to reach out to professionals in the sports media industry, co-authors, and I'm like, hey, so just gonna shoot my shot and ask for a podcast appearance, and y'all.
We love talking, as you can tell. It's a favorite of ours.
Y'all made it easy. Like I was like, oh, do I have enough material? Is this gonna crash and burn? And y'all made it easy. I appreciate it so much. That concludes this episode. You can check out the complete series on my personal YouTube channel. Thank you to my guests, as well as the faculty and advisors in the Department of Media and Communication at East Tennessee State University. I'm Brian Lehman, and thank you for listening.